If in you telling a story, you can make up an imaginary God, and that God can do pretty much anything you can imagine, which sounds awesome until you consider the flip side. He may be able to do anything a believer can imagine, but he can't do nothing that the believer can't imagine. And we see a good example of that every time a believer tries to argue against evolution. Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on the book I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Norm Geisler and Frank Turk. We's up to Chapter 6, entitled New Life Forms, From the Goo to You Via the Zoo. But you might not know that the way the first two sections just go back and repeat the same argument they was making back in Chapter 5. And that's a key point in apologetic strategy. A bad argument, repeated often enough, will sound convincing to someone who wants to believe it. See, life is complicated, and a lot of folks ain't got time to really dig in and analyze everything, so they rely on recognition and familiarity to identify what's right, and constant repetition makes things sound familiar. There's a whole lot of things like talking snakes and the Trinity and a loving God who sends folks to hell that sounds right to some folks for no better reason than that they's used to hearing them. And Geisler and Turk's taking advantage of that. But finally, by the third section of Chapter 6, they's ready to start talking about what the chapter is supposed to be talking about. And that's evolution, or as Geisler and Turk call it, macroevolution. Quote, Darwinists say that this has happened by natural selection, but the term natural selection is a misnomer. Since the process of evolution is, by definition, without intelligence, there is no selection at all going on. The term natural selection simply means that the fittest creatures survive. But so what? That's true by definition. The fittest survive. This is called a tautology, a circular argument that doesn't prove anything. End quote. So just like Geisler and Turk fail to understand the differences between molecules and messages, they also fail to understand the difference between the name of a thing and the thing itself. Natural selection is simply a convenient name for an observed phenomenon whose precise definition is closer to differential reproductive success within a population, leading to an accumulation of beneficial traits and a filtering out of deleterious ones. Which in plain English is just saying that in a given population of organisms, some individuals is going to be more successful at reproducing than others, which is going to add their genes back into the gene pool. And therefore the genes that made them more successful will be more likely to accumulate in the gene pool over time, and meanwhile organisms that had genes that made them less successful will be less likely to reproduce and return their genes to the gene pool, resulting in their genes gradually being filtered out from generation to generation to generation. And that ain't really all that difficult a concept to grasp, whether you use the plain English version or the more technical version. But either way, you still gotta admit it's a heap ton easier just to say natural selection. Geisler and Turk is pulling a bait and switch, where they substitute the name natural selection for the actual process that natural selection denotes. They want to be sure that the well is good and poisoned before they get around to trying to discuss the actual evidence that scientists have found in support of evolution. And of course, if you've been following the creation-evolution debate at all, you know that Creationist has a whole bingo card full of arguments that supposedly disproves evolution. And no matter how many times each of them arguments is debunked, Creationists just keep putting them right back on the bingo card. And I'm kind of looking forward to it, because it's kind of fun in a low-hanging fruit sort of way. Plus, I have a few points of my own that I don't often see other folks raising, and I'm looking forward to presenting them. Before we get to the bingo card, though, there's some important background considerations that I want us all to keep in mind. And the first one is the point that I made in the beginning of this video. An imaginary God can do anything that believers can imagine, at least in the stories they tell about him, but even an all-wise, all-knowing, all-powerful imaginary God can't do nothing that his believers is unwilling or unable to imagine. And I apologize to all the imaginary goddesses out there for using the masculine pronoun as if all gods was masculine, but if you'll kindly bear with me, I'm going to keep doing that as a convenient way to distinguish between they, meaning creationists from the Abrahamic traditions, and he, meaning the creator referred to by the Abrahamic traditions. No disrespect is intended toward any female imaginary creator mothers out there. But anyways, my main point is that the guys who thought up the Genesis creator had nowhere near a good enough understanding of biology and genetics to be able to imagine God creating evolution. Nowadays, of course, we do have believers who understand biology well enough to be able to imagine a creator God creating a biological system as creative and elegant and sophisticated as evolution, and they do imagine that he created it. But in order to do that, you have to admit that the folks today know more about how God supposedly created life on earth than the people who wrote the book of Genesis, which means that a literal reading of Genesis ain't necessarily going to be correct. And that in turn is going to undermine the whole story of talking snakes and the fall of man into sin, which is an essential ingredient of the gospel story. If and the whole human race ain't born into sin as a result of the fall, then we don't need no divine Messiah to literally die for us to save us from that sin. And the whole premise of the gospel goes right out the window. Consequently, biblical literalists ain't willing to imagine God creating anything as awesome as biological evolution. Bronze Age believers did not imagine the Creator that way because they weren't able to. But modern creationists don't imagine him that way because they ain't willing to. Modern creationists know that God did not create a complete working evolutionary system because that would contradict their beliefs. And that in itself is an interesting certainty, by the way, because if the Creator was actually real, there'd always be a certain element of doubt. Ask any creationist why different gospels say that different numbers of women went to the tomb after the crucifixion, and they'll gladly inform you that it ain't a contradiction on account of the Bible don't always write down every single detail, and that the Bible being silent about something don't necessarily mean that it didn't happen. And if God was real, that would apply to Genesis too. The fact that Genesis don't mention God creating evolution wouldn't necessarily mean that he didn't do it. So there'd always be an element of doubt about whether or not evolution might have been part of God's design for creation. But Geisler and Turk ain't got no doubt. None at all. And the only folks who can be that infallibly certain about the details of a story is the folks that's the ones making that story up. That level of certainty don't exist outside of authors describing their own fiction, and Geisler and Turk has got that level of certainty. That's why they don't feel no shame nor remorse about using arguments like the one they opened with. They know beyond all possibility of doubt that they can't have got their story wrong, and therefore they's justified in using any means they can to convince other folks to believe in their story too, as we'll see when Geisler and Turk continue to present their case. Quote, "Here's what observation tells us. The surviving bacteria always stay bacteria. They do not evolve into another type of organism. That would be macroevolution. Natural selection has never been observed to create new types." End quote. And the context here is that they're talking about infectious bacteria evolving resistance to antibiotics, which is exactly what evolutionary theory predicts. Antibiotic-resistant bacteria has evolved in the years since the discovery of penicillin, and creationists can't deny it, unless they wants to die of MRSA or something. This is one of the few instances where creationists has actually been forced to edit their bingo cards. They used to claim that it was impossible for a mutation to be beneficial, and they can't claim that no more because not only has it been repeatedly observed, but now we can sequence bacterial genomes and document exactly which mutations make the bacteria resistant. So the new square on the bingo card is one that says, quote-unquote, macroevolution is somehow different from, quote-unquote, microevolution, which is important because that way they can claim that any evolution we actually observe is only microevolution while still denying what they call macroevolution. So how do they know that there's a separate mechanism for so-called macroevolution that's different from the mechanism for so-called microevolution? They don't. Creationists has never been able to describe a mechanism by which so-called microevolution could be prevented from accumulating enough changes to qualify as macroevolution. The only way they know there's a difference is because they know their imaginary God couldn't have created evolution, and therefore there must be some kind of evolution that ain't real. So they splits off the part they can't deny and call it microevolution, and then say that macroevolution is the part that their God never created. But we could just as easily say that so-called macroevolution is the part that their God failed to create. It was too hard for him. He tried to create evolution, but the best he could manage was simple microevolution. He couldn't sustain it across larger ranges of biological descent. Scientists can describe a mechanism that would work across a full range of living organisms, but God failed. He's an imaginary God. He can only create what Bronze Age believers was willing and able to imagine. And that's how Gossler and Turek can know infallibly, beyond any possibility of doubt, that macroevolution ain't part of God's creation, no matter how awesome macroevolution would be. And as for resistant bacteria still being bacteria, that's yet another square on the creationist bingo card. And that one's been there for as long as there's been a creationist bingo card, which is pretty ironic considering that this is exactly what evolutionary theory predicts. Everything that descends from the first eukaryote is going to be a eukaryote. Everything that descends from the first vertebrate is going to still be a vertebrate, and so on and so on. Evolution works by variations appearing in the gene pool and then spreading across the gene pool over multiple generations until circumstances split the gene pool and let each new pool evolve separate from the other. And because evolution works within a pool of genes instead of just in isolated individuals, the descendants is always going to be related to their ancestors. Each individual is going to reproduce after its own kind, and only when the pool as a whole is split into new pools do new species emerge. The result of that process is a nested structure called the tree of life. The descendants being part of the same heritage as their parents is what makes it a tree instead of a bunch of separate, unrelated organisms. Creationists like to think that evolution means a crocodile giving birth to a duck or some other wacky magical monstrosity, but that's the exact opposite of evolution. And yet, even though Gossler and Turek's example actually confirms part of evolutionary theory, Gossler and Turek is bound and determined that it ought to disprove it, or at least fail to support it. Because again, they know infallibly and without any possibility of doubt that evolution ain't part of their imaginary God's creation. And to try and bolster their case, they call in Berkeley law professor Philip Johnson, author of Darwin on Trial, which has been praised by some as being the central textbook of the intelligent design movement. Johnson says, quote, "None of the proofs for natural selection provides any persuasive reason for believing that natural selection can produce new species, new organs, or other major changes, or even minor changes that are permanent." End quote. And that is technically correct. Evolutionary theory involves many mechanisms that contribute to the overall evolution of new species, and of those many mechanisms, natural selection is not the one that introduces novel traits into population. Evolution as a whole can do it, which is a good thing for young Earth creationists, because if entirely new species could not arise by natural evolution, then creationists would be completely incapable of accounting for all the millions and millions of species that exist on Earth today without Noah needing to take millions and millions of pairs of animals on board the ark, which was too small to hold that many critters. And what's worth noticing here is that Gossler and Turek is quoting Philip Johnson as saying that evolution can't produce new species, even though they themselves just got done admitting that evolution does produce new species. They try and weasel out of it by calling it microevolution, but it's still a contradiction, because evolution, micro or otherwise, can't produce new species without doing all the things that Johnson denies it can do. I reckon the Berkeley Law program don't spend too much time teaching evolutionary biology to their law students. But then again, maybe that's why I shouldn't go to a law professor with questions about evolutionary biology. Gossler and Turek go on to argue that, quote, "genetic limits seem to be built into the basic types," end quote. And that's why dog breeders, for example, has been able to produce Chihuahuas and Great Danes and St. Bernards, but has never been able to reproduce the kinds of changes that typically happen over hundreds of thousands of years via evolutionary mechanisms. It ain't because dog breeders has only been doing this for a few hundred years, it's because there seem to be genetic limits built into the dog type. And never mind the fossil history of how the so-called dog type has evolved over the 40 million years since the evolution of the first canids. Bronze Age believers couldn't imagine dogs evolving from earlier ancestors, and therefore the creator god they made up could not create an evolutionary system capable of evolving dogs. And that's how Gossler and Turek know that there must be genetic limits built into dog evolution, even though no creationist has ever found a mechanism capable of specifying such a limit, let alone applying and enforcing it. See, the biological problem here is that if there was such a limit, it'd have to be encoded in the DNA somehow. And there's basically a couple ways this could be done. For each trait that defines what a dog is, there'd have to be a standard value for that trait, plus some kind of code for how far away that trait could get from its standard value. Plus, of course, whatever the current value is for the current individual. Or alternately, there could be some kind of minimum and maximum value for each trait, plus again, whatever the current value is. In other words, for each trait that a dog has, there would need to be at least 2 additional values beyond the value that the current individual has, which would at least triple the amount of genetic information that would be needed to specify genetically that this was a dog and not some other kind of critter. And of course, that extra genetic information ain't there. We can sequence DNA now and identify genes that perform specific functions within the organism. And nobody, not scientists, not creationists, not nobody, has ever found any mechanism in any species or kind or type or whatever that limits the range of variation for that species or kind or type. The only reason Gossler and Turek can be so sure that the limit must be there is because they know infallibly and without any possible doubt that evolution ain't part of their God's creation. They's the ones telling the story, and that ain't how the story goes. They make the same argument again in slightly different terms by saying, quote, changes are not directional toward the development of new life forms as macroevolutionary theory requires, but they simply shift back and forth within a limited range, end quote. And the only thing they got right in that sentence is the fact that evolutionary changes ain't directional. Evolutionary theory predicts that changes ain't going to be directional. And Gossler and Turek know it, since only a few pages ago they was arguing that natural selection can't select anything due to the lack of intelligent guidance. They're just desperate to try and discredit evolution any way they can, because again, they know without any possible doubt that evolution ain't part of the Genesis creation. And their argument gives us a good example how this kind of absolute certainty can lead to bad science. So back in 2004 and 2005, there was a drought in the Galapagos Islands that put a huge amount of evolutionary stress on the finches that lived there. Researchers who was studying the finches noticed that medium-sized ground finches with large beaks was starving to death due to competition from bigger birds with bigger beaks, better suited for eating the larger seeds that were the main food source for the little finches. Most of the surviving ground finches had smaller beaks, better suited to eating smaller seeds that the larger competitors ignored, which resulted in the genetic variant for small beaks becoming a larger percentage of the gene pool. And that's all perfectly normal, perfectly consistent with evolutionary expectations. But the conclusion that Gossler and Turek draw is this, quote, Darwin's finches had varying beak sizes which correlated with the weather, end quote. To hear Gossler and Turek tell it, medium ground finches is checking the weather forecast and saying, gonna be hot and dry this year, I better grow a small beak. Which of course is downright silly. Gossler and Turek take an ordinary, predictable example of environmental conditions having an impact on which individual finches survive to add their genes back into the gene pool, and from that they somehow extract a conclusion that exactly confirms their prior expectations, including the part where there's some kind of invisible genetic limit that forces beak sizes to stay within a certain range. And that ain't how science works. It's how confirmation bias works, but it ain't how science works. And it all goes back to the limitations that God has to work with. He may have all wisdom and all knowledge and all imaginable power, but he ain't got the power to create evolution, because the folks who originally imagined him couldn't imagine him creating evolution. And now Gossler and Turk is stuck, because they can't admit that the Bronze Age authors of Genesis got it wrong without admitting that Genesis itself might not be literally true. And if Genesis itself ain't literally true, then there goes the whole gospel. And I'm sure there's lots more could be said, and in fact a lot more that's already been said by more qualified folks than me. But that's going to about do it for me for today. Next time we'll pick up where we left off, start with Gossler and Turk's argument on quote-unquote specified complexity, which is just more low-hanging fruit. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.